Hello, my name is Amy, and today I'm going to be talking about the Indian Act, residential schools, and the ethical judgments that were made to justify oppression in Canada. Before we start talking about those things, just a little disclaimer. The word Indian is a historically inaccurate and now a derogatory word that was used to describe Indigenous people. There are other terms that we can use, such as Indigenous, Aboriginal, First Nations, or First People. The only context in which Indian is going to be used in this video is in historical context, and that is the only context that it should be used in. Indigenous people have been living on the land of what we now know as Canada for hundreds, if not thousands of years. They used to be the only people there, and they lived off the land, traveled freely, and were able to express and celebrate their cultures. That all changed when colonizers from foreign nations came and created a country of their own on stolen land. Tensions obviously rose. The same people who claimed the land that was not rightfully theirs decided that that wasn't enough, and they claimed Indigenous culture, children, languages, and future generations to come. What ethical judgments were made to justify oppression in Canada? In 1876, almost 10 years after Canada's founding, the Canadian government passed a set of laws that was called the Indian Act. The government's goal for this was to get more land for colonizers and to assimilate the Indigenous people on said land. The Canadian government decided that the most effective way to do this was to take Indigenous children away from their home and engulf them in Euro-Canadian culture. They tried other methods too, like banning cultural gatherings such as potlucks and creating reserves and numbered treaties, but nothing worked as well as the schools. In 1884, the Canadian government required, by law, that Indigenous children attend residential schools. The schools were funded by the Canadian government, but they were run by different Christian religious groups like Anglican, Catholic, Presbyterian, and United Churches. When the children got to the schools, they had to learn and speak in only English or French, depending on the location of the schools. They were not allowed to practice any form of Indigenous culture, and they could not see their families. Indigenous families obviously wanted to see their children. Very few schools allowed visits or family days, but most of them did not respect, talk to, or cooperate with the families. Even though it was very clear that Indigenous people did not want the schools to run, the government opened up more. The conditions got worse, teachers were abusive, the food was scarce and rotten, and they were isolated from their families, and most importantly, the children were made to feel ashamed and embarrassed about their culture. The last residential school in Canada closed in 1996. Approximately 150,000 children attended residential schools. Around 6,000 children died while in the schools. Residential schools and the Indian Act still affect Indigenous people to this day. Recognizing the trauma that the government has inflicted on Indigenous people is crucial to understanding our history. The Canadian government truly believed that Indigenous people needed to become like them and fit their standards. They believed that Indigenous people needed Christianity and they needed to get rid of the cultural, social, economic, and political differences. They did this by inflicting intergenerational trauma on Indigenous people through the Indian Act and residential schools. They decided that these judgments were ethical and that the assimilation of Indigenous people was the best possible thing that the government could do. We in Canada and the Canadian government recognize that these acts of judgment were absolutely horrible. We are working towards reconciling with Indigenous people, but there are still many things that we need to do. As I mentioned in this video, residential schools and the Indian Act caused intergenerational trauma, which still affects Indigenous people to this day. In the description box, I've put some links to websites, charities, foundations, different resources that you can take time to look at to better your understanding of this topic. There are also many issues affecting Indigenous people currently, such as missing and murdered Indigenous women, land rights, and different pipelines. I strongly encourage you to look at these resources and really take the time to read them to try to learn about some of the issues that are affecting Indigenous people today. Thank you very much for watching.